why don't we go ahead and get started? And before I forget, I'll introduce myself too. I always forget this part, but I'm Mitra Motasham, the West Virginia Project ECHO coordinator. So, all right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Amanda, I can pull up your didactic for you, and anytime you would like the next slide, just let me know and go ahead and do that for you.
Okay. So hello, everybody. Welcome on this very sunny Wednesday. It is beautiful out. I'm going to talk with you about screen time. So hopefully you do get out and get some sun and away from these screens, right? Because COVID has now even increased screen time. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So my learning objectives, my next slide has my learning objectives. The learning objectives for today. I just hope that you guys, I'm going to do an overview of effects of screen time on children and adolescents. Some of the effects, I want to talk about some of the supportive impacts, some of the negative impacts, because we're always hearing about the negative impacts. And then I want to talk about how we move forward from that. So how we develop some media plans and what some successful programs look like. So we'll go ahead and get started with that. So the next slide has, when we talk about screen time and media, so we're not going to talk about media as in the news, we're talking about media as in television and what people are watching. And so what we mean by screen time and media, we're looking at phones, TVs, game systems, movies, whiteboards, tablets, computers. And again, not all negative. There are definitely positive impacts of these, and a lot of these are utilized for educational and now work components a lot. And so there's not always a negative impact, but we're talking about the impacts on kids. So the next slide. So sorry you have to do this. I'm so used to doing my own slides. I'm on my iPad and I can't figure out how to do my PowerPoint on my iPad. So sorry, guys. See, talk about screen time. So negative impacts, of course, come with high consumption of screen time and low quality of the content. And so if you have kids that are on the screen all the time with some really explicit content, then naturally you're going to have some negative impacts. We know from research that those impacts interfere with sleep. So we have kids with a lot of sleep disturbances. Many of the times kids go to sleep with screens. They get TV before bed, and what happens is they're being transitioned to that sleep cycle. And so their brain almost requires that stimulation then for them to even go to sleep, but they're still not getting that full deep sleep. If you think about it, falling asleep and leaving the TV on. And have you ever heard something that's on a show and it just all of a sudden wakes you up? Because you're not in that deep sleep. And so it keeps you in a sleep state, and especially for kids, that it's really important for them to have. And it can be very stimulating. So a lot of the times what happens is our kids who have some hyperactivity, they have this sleep disturbance, let's say they're going to bed with the TV on, and they're not getting into that deep sleep. And so then they awake very easily because their mind's stimulated from that screen time right before bed. And so then you have parents saying, well, they don't stay asleep. They're not going to sleep. They wake up and then they're up. Well, because their mind's pretty much stayed stimulated and they've not been able to go into that deep sleep. So there's a lot of research around that. Distractibility. And so screens and background noises can absolutely distract kids. So you think about the toddlers who are playing, and a lot of the times parents will say, I'll have kids who come in. I had one kid and it just sticks out in my mind. The parents loved horror films, right? And they can never watch the horror films without the kids around. So they would kind of watch it. And then they said, well, we would pause it though when the bad stuff would come on and if the kids turned around and watched it. But they're still hearing it, right? And even though they might be playing and in their own language, they're still hearing it and they're still understanding it. It's still that background noise. And it really impacts development on top of the content. So these little kids were talking about killing people and, had some language control issues. And so the parents quickly identified that and they saw a huge reduction when they stopped. But you know, when we talked about being exposed, they're like, I really thought they were too young. The reality is that at 18 months, kids can start making sense of what they're seeing in movies and on screens. And so they can start at a very young age to identify that. And if you think about even toddlers and the background noise, you know, when we talk about screen time and what screen time looks like in the home, when we explore media plans, families will say, well, it's on in the background, but they're not really paying attention to it. And even if it's educational, right? Even if they have educational pieces on in the background, kids do pay attention to it. Have you ever watched a toddler like playing, and they're like playing in their own little world, and then something happens on TV and they're like glued to the TV, right? And they're like, oh, so it caught their eye, and then they're off playing in their world. So that interferes with their imaginative play, right? It distracts that play and it impacts their development. Not saying they're going to be developmentally delayed from that, but if they had other risk factors, it very well can be a contributor. So just kind of identifying that. And kids being left unattended. I mean, a lot of the times the reality is, you know, parents will give screens to kids to kind of keep them distracted, keep them busy, and then they're left unattended. And many of the times kids will get on to different content that they shouldn't be on. YouTube is, you know, there's YouTube Kids, and a lot of the times YouTube things will come up, and parents are like, oh, well, they're just on YouTube. Well, sometimes you're not always seeing the videos they're watching on YouTube. Not that they're all bad, but sometimes you're not monitoring that. And so just being aware of those things and those negative impacts. The next slide. So there are some effects with media and screen time on language, and that's probably one of the bigger ones that's identified early on. And there's good effects and there's some negative effects, but it again goes back to, you know, us giving screens to kids and then reducing that parent-child interaction. Kids need to see that formulation with their mouths. They need some positive, nurturing language to help them develop. And so that parent-child interaction reduces when we place them on screens or in front of screens. And so that definitely does have an impact on language. However, some of the positives about screen time and language is if you are monitoring some of the content, a lot of the educational programs will have kids repeat items. And so even Dora, right? So if you think about Dora will say something and then you have to repeat it. You can hear kids like repeating what they're hearing on there. And that's great because it's helping develop their language. They're responding and they're developing. Still a little hard to identify mouth movement with cartoons, but they're responding and they're reflecting, which is part of speech and language development and can be very beneficial. Next slide. So promoting positive language, again, you need that nurturing and positive language to develop. And we're talking about supportive language, like you're doing great. I really love how you said that word, or reflecting appropriate verbalizations. A lot of the times parents will go into correct verbalizations. And so they'll say, no, that's not how you say it. You say it this way. And instead of correcting, you can just reflect. That really helps promote language development. Language-rich peers. So having kids that are around each other that speak the same language or on the same level. If you, I don't know if you guys ever saw that commercial, speaking of screens, but if you ever saw that commercial, there's the kids that are talking about diabetes and their parents having diabetes. And it's so funny. Like the kids, their language and how they're talking, like they're just talking about it. Yeah, my dad can't eat ice cream because he has diabetes. And so but it's on a kid level and they need that. And they need that for their development. And when they're on screens, they don't have those pieces. There are some screens that have, and some programs that have that narrative. So narrating daily can help with language development. So just describing what they're doing, you're moving the truck, you're going up and down. And a lot of the times there are screens that have stories or they're narrating what another child is doing. And that's why those YouTube videos, parents are always like, I don't know why they watch those stupid YouTube videos where there's kids on there talking about what they're opening up, like surprise videos. And it's because they're narrating. It's their peers and they're narrating exactly what they're doing. They're completely harmless. And it's really actually a positive thing for language development. So depending on the content, some things can be beneficial. Labeling, and again, we've talked about the mouth movement information and how important that is for language and language development. And so for kids, you know, we're going to talk a little bit later on about ages and what that looks like, but for a while they were saying kids 2 and under shouldn't have any screen time because they need all of these pieces to promote language development. And we were seeing a lot of kids with some speech delays. Now 2 and under is 36 minutes of screen time. I'm not really sure where the exact precise 36 came from, but that's what it is. But so next slide. If you talk about the impacts of screen time and media in early childhood, it really has an impact because, I mean, we've talked about the language delays, but it really has an impact because if you think about infants and toddlers, they really require that outside world to help them grow and develop. And so when you're looking at development, it's so important for infants and toddlers to learn from their environment, to explore their environment, to feel safe and secure, to touch things, feel things, explore things. They need that physical stimulation. They need the challenges. They need positive stress. They need to get frustrated with the fact that, you know, they can't put shapes in the shape sorter, or you know, they can't throw the garbage in the garbage can. They need to get frustrated with those things. And so those experiences are so very important early on. And if they're in front of screens a lot, they can't have those experiences, or it reduces their experiences significantly. If their daily routine is to be on a screen for 60% of the day, that's so much that they're missing out on, right? And so if they're on more than half a day, even half a day is a lot for an infant and toddler. So we know from the literature that it does create the sleep disturbances that we talked about. Poor eating habits, right? They come and go and eat. They eat while they're watching, not paying attention how much they're eating, or at times what they're eating. And also, you know, attention and focus. Attention and focus is a huge one. They're learning to give, and especially when you have background noise and you have you know, TVs on in the background, what they're learning is to be attentive, not focusing on what they're doing. So if you have a child sitting there building blocks, instead of focusing, imagining, creating, they're listening to that background noise too. So they're in and out and back and forth. And so then you're creating interactions that start to look like some hyperactivity, right? And some attention and focus issues. And so a lot of the times that can be a contributor. In adolescence, same thing, screen time and media have an impact on their sleep as well. Low activity, I had one teenager tell me, he's like, but I have the virtual reality games, so we're really doing, or the Wii that like you're doing like kickboxing and stuff. Well, that's not all the time, and it's still, you know, the reality is it's still low activity compared to some of the other activities you can engage in. And so we have had discussions about that, but still looking at things in a positive way, right? Totally encourage the Wii workouts, like 100%. So really looking at a media plan and how to create that. Behavior concerns. I mean, it absolutely can create behavior concerns. The reality is that we know that screen time and media, they both increase the capacity for an addiction towards that. The research has identified that it lights up the same neural pathways as cocaine, right? And so it definitely has an addictive component. And so a lot of the times reducing the screen time is a huge issue, and you do get behavior concerns from both groups: infants, toddlers, adolescents. Adolescents are a little more stronger because they got some force, and so they've chances are they've been doing it longer, and so we definitely get some behaviors around that. But it is like an addiction, and we do have to monitor it, and we do have to manage it that way. And so when we're going to reduce it, we do look at it in that capacity. And we develop plans all around that. And for younger children, it's the same thing. If you think about it in the stimulation sense that we're talking about, you know, your development goes on this natural curve. And for kids who are experiencing these, you know, these stimulation spikes, it throws off your development completely because you're spiking. That stimulation is spiking up and down instead of a natural curve. And so it definitely has an impact. Social engagement. We're seeing teens who are having more of a difficult time engaging socially. They're having a difficult time taking social cues, being comfortable in public settings, and so it definitely has impact. And also increased risk for metabolic syndrome. And so that's, metabolic syndrome is the increased risk for heart disease, stroke, and diabetes, and that's coming from the low activity. So next slide. Music. So I get asked this all the time about music versus screen time. Parents will say, you know, is music the same thing? Is it, it's like media, so should it be? And it's not the same. Now, there has been some research that shows that it does reduce language input. However, it doesn't impact the same as screens, and it doesn't interfere with learning the same way. Actually, there are some studies that have identified that music stimulates learning a little bit more. It can highlight some of those parts of the brain that help stimulate that. So it is not the same. So supportive media. The next slide. Sorry. When we're looking at supportive media, you want to look at what, of course, age appropriately. So if we're looking at, for example, if we're looking at early childhood, you want supportive media like shapes, colors, read alouds, where they're reading books, smart boards. So the whiteboards and smart boards, while there are some stimulating pieces to those because of the colors, you know, that appear and come about, it can be stimulating, but in an educational way, it can be very beneficial. Sorting, I mean, there are all kinds of educational screen times and medias that you can get involved in that would be super great for kids. Again, it's all about monitoring that. You know, and especially now with COVID, and we don't know when the kids are going to be returning. And for kids who have had screen time, that's a lot of the questions that I get now with parents, is they're like, their screen time's increasing with school, like, so how much screen time should I have at home? And again, we'll talk about media plans, but the reality is it's all about the involvement, not necessarily the screen time. You know, I think it came to surprise with some of the parents that kids were already receiving screen time at school. There were still a lot of screens at school. And so it's all about your involvement and staying involved and just monitoring that. So next slide. Things you want to avoid, though, especially in early childhood: loud, fast moving, multiple colors, and explicit language. Supportive media is great. Looking at the content, what type of programs kids should be looking at. And the reality is too, is that marketing is fabulous. Like, people who market for some of these programs know exactly the target age range they want, and they know what stimulates them. If you think about Teletubbies, which is on one of the, I don't know if any of you even remember Teletubbies, but Teletubbies. So if you think about Teletubbies, those are one of the programs that were on, completely uneducational, did not help children at all, right? And so that was not a supportive media. That was not a great thing for children to watch, but children were fascinated with it. Why? Well, because if you look at their primary colors, if they're going towards that age, they've marketed with primary colors, with baby talk. That's what kids like at that age. So they're watching it, they're getting stimulated, but they're not getting anything from it. And so that really wasn't a supportive media. But you know, if you look at it, they had some loud moments when Nunu came in, and so it totally were things that we needed to avoid. But you know, it wasn't necessarily bad, but it was not helpful. And so those are kind of things you want to look at. What would be more supportive? I tell people all the time, I have like a whole Mr. Rogers DVD series that I use for another parenting training that I do. And I show providers the difference in some of the content of some different kids shows, and just to see the difference is amazing. You know, Fred Rogers does a great job of pulling kids from the imaginary world into reality. And if you think about it, he always has that. He begins in the real world and he ends in the real world. But he goes to this imaginary place where it's like so fun for kids. And there's always pro-social messages throughout that program. That's such supportive media. And that's so important because, you know, a lot of the times kids get sucked into this imaginary world, and for younger kids it's hard to pull out of that. And that's why you see younger kids in the grocery stores and everywhere you go pretending they're ninjas and everything else, right? Because they're still imagining, and that's perfect for development. But at some point they need to identify the difference, and if they're overexposed to screen time or media, then they're going to have a really hard time differentiating between the two. But if you have a show that does that, and if you have a parent that's involved that does that, it's really important to do that. Okay, next slide. So the American Academy of Pediatrics, again, a year ago, they had standards for every age, right? Now what their guidelines are pretty much saying is children over 2 years old should have no more than 2 hours. And if you think about that, like, I don't know about you guys, but I have patients that come in where the kids are on the screen all day long. Once they get off the game system, they're watching TV. And so that's still screen time. And so we talk about that. We talk about media plans and how to reduce that. And we'll talk about different programs that help you effectively reduce that. But really what the guidelines from the American Academy of Pediatrics is now is just to have caution and stay involved. So again, paying attention to how much and the content, and also the language, but staying involved, being there, being present is important. So really focusing on that piece. And again, so there's a book, it's called it's called Resetting Your Child's Brain. It's by Victoria Dunkley. And she talks a lot in there about she goes over, the research that's been identified, how it is similar to an addiction. But she goes through different plans in different ages of how to kind of titrate kids down when they are so used to screen time and media for long periods of time. So it's a great book if you guys are looking for anything like that. But next slide. If you're looking at social media plans, so here's what we do. When I'm working with a family on a social media plan, I talk with them about developing expectations together. So as an entire family, even for the little ones, right? Even if there's just minor participation with the little ones, that's okay. They feel involved, they feel included, and that's important. A lot of the times we have to develop some plans for the parents. Sometimes we went to develop a media plan with one of my families, and they were like, okay, you know what, they have a basket in the kitchen by the sink, and they said, our phones go in the basket as soon as we come home because it is way too distracting. And then at 7 o'clock, we pick them back up, right? And so they've set clear guidelines for themselves. And this is where that book could come in handy, because we look at guidelines on how to titrate down and provide clear guidelines for kids. Kids like routine. They like to know what's coming next. Now, I will say that they'll probably manipulate the situation because it is like an addiction and they're used to that. They want that screen time. And many of the times for younger kids, that's why parents end up giving in, is because they throw such a tantrum that, they just can't manage the behaviors. And at that point, we talk about other ways to kind of manage. Making sure that there's age appropriate options, whether it's, even with your guidelines setting, maybe kid lock. So if it's 2 hours a day, the phone shuts off at the 2 hours. If you set specific time frames that they can have the screen, whatever it might be, just making sure you're very clear with your guidelines and that they're age appropriate. And staying engaged, having parents stay engaged. So stay there with them, sit down with them and look at it. I mean, I will tell you, I sit down and watch my daughter when she's on the screen at times, and I can't stand it. Like, it is she loves playing like this game where you build houses, and it's so detailed, and I'm not detailed, and I hate sitting there watching it. But I do it because I want her to know that I'm going to stay engaged. I want to watch what you're watching. It's a big red flag if she puts her phone down the minute I come over and she shuts it off. What are you doing? Nothing. What were you doing? Nothing. Let's see what you were doing, right? And so, you know, just making sure you stay involved, expecting manipulation. I mean, manipulation is not a bad word for kids. It's just how they get their needs met. And they're wired to manipulate us. And so it's really important to expect that. And reduce incentivizing with screen time. So a lot of the times parents will have that as an incentive. You know, if you clean your room, then you can have extra screen time, or you can have, so you wanna get away from doing that because you know, we are trying to still monitor it and keep it low, and chances are kids are going to do that. Now, that doesn't mean eliminate it, because sometimes we have to do that when we're creating media plans, especially for kids who are heavily involved. I mean, I had one kid who was spending like 13 hours a day on the screen, and we're talking like games, like that's not even TV. We didn't even measure the TV. And so we had to, you know, we had to incentivize at first because he didn't know what else to do. And so a lot of the times you have to reintroduce those interactions. What else can they do? Expect that they're going to say, I'm bored, I have nothing to do, right? Well, so sometimes with the younger kids, what we're doing is we're reintroducing play. We're teaching them again how to play, how to interact. And so you might have to do that. And so for those situations, we've had to use screen time as an incentive because that was the only way they would begin to interact. But slowly, as you introduce other interactions instead of the screen time, then it's really beneficial, and it starts to reduce on its own. So just keeping that in mind, not to eliminate it, but sometimes you do have to reduce it. Okay, next one. So these are some great media plans. If you look them up, Screen Sense, Common Sense Media, EAMES, we'll go over EAMES and we'll go over Screen Sense because those are my two favorite. But those have great, and PBS Kids have great, if you look up PBS Kids online, they have great guidelines too, as well as, you know, age appropriate content and what to allow kids to watch. I just had a parent tell me yesterday that during COVID, so they only let their kids watch PBS Kids. And during COVID, they told me that they started letting them watch Disney Plus, and they started noticing more sexually explicit language with them. And they're 6 years old. And I was just like shocked. But if you ever watch some of those shows, there are some like sexually explicit, like it's just, it seems to be more common. So it's interesting. Okay, next one. So the EAMES model, this is everything we've been talking about. Engaging, staying engaged, staying involved, watching the activity. What is the activity? And if you have to introduce new activities to replace the screen time, involvement, meaningful, making it meaningful. So try to gear it towards those educational components. I mean, kids love, you know, things that are not educational too, like the Teletubbies, but I mean, Teletubbies are not anything new. So, but I mean, before they used to love that. But just making sure that it's meaningful and staying social with it. So another way that you can stay social with it, I talk to parents about, you know, this is again, pulling from what they're learning into the real world and staying social with it. So if a kid's on the screen playing a game where they're learning shapes, right? And you're driving down the street, it's a great time to say, there's a stop sign like the one we saw, right? There's a triangle, you know, for yield signs, there's a triangle like the one from your game. So really helping them start to link when a train's going by. There's a train like Thomas on your show. You know, a lot of the times counting games involve apples and oranges. And so when you're in the grocery store, counting the apples and oranges and referring back to that game. Remember your game, we're counting apples and oranges just like your game, right? And so you're starting to link both worlds and allowing them to pull that over. So you're staying involved, they're starting to see it in the other world, and that can be just as stimulating. So it reduces the need for that screen time. Okay, next slide. Screen Sense is a great one too. So it has great guidelines, it lays it out. Again, limiting the screen time. They talk about ways to limit it, avoiding the background noise, how that impacts on development. Removing screens from bedrooms. I mean, we've talked about how that impacts sleep, and a lot of the times that's probably a big piece. Is almost every kid I see has a screen in the bedroom. And so removing screens from bedrooms so that they're not used to going to sleep with that stimulation. Making sure you choose child content, having that interactive experience like we're talking about, bringing it to real life, connecting to daily activities, and being creative during video chats. I think this is a great one, especially during COVID. You know, learning how to be creative with video chats. We did this a lot with parents who were either separated or deployed, who might have been on long trips, parents who, you know, were incarcerated. So we've done a lot of work around video chats, and you know, there's a lot of different things you can do. Puppets on video chats, those are great things to go back and forth. Kids are so hard to talk to on video chats, and sometimes parents expect them to sit there and talk and have a conversation when they really typically wouldn't anyways if you were sitting there. So it's all about being creative with that. Puppets are great. We've worked with parents on getting the same books. So the child has the same book as the parent and reading it together, going through the pages, showing art on there, drawing pictures, doing interactive games where each one's drawing one versus the other and showing what they've drawn. You know, both draw a picture of the family and then they hold it up and show each other what their families look like. And so really just being interactive with some of the video chats. ScreenSense has a lot of that, and it's great. So next slide, thank you. So parent screen use. Again, talking with parents about watching things in the background, having that background noise. I had a dad that played video games all the time. They started bringing well, actually the school recommended their daughter to come to receive an evaluation because she was talking about killing people. No other problems, no academic issues, no behavior issues, but she was just like randomly saying about killing this person and killing that person. And here dad just got a new game, and it was a war, I think it was Call of Duty. It was like a war game. It was intense, and he was killing people. And she was playing, it was in their basement. She was playing with her, that's where her dollhouse was. And he had no clue she was listening or looking or watching. And it's just kind of that background noise. At times she was. And so that just became a language she started, it was used nowhere else. They couldn't identify it at first. And so through our evaluation and discussing it, they're like, oh, needless to say, mom was very mad at dad. But they got through it, they got over it. He stopped and the language stopped. So it's not always that easy, but that, you know, that was a simple case, but interesting how just that little bit of interaction, I mean, she literally probably saw it maybe for 2 or 3 days and started using that language. And so had such a huge impact. And now, you know, saying those things in that type of setting is really very serious. So definitely looking at that background noise, how it's distracting, having interactive time, the content on your own screen time. How many times is a parent watching something on their screen and a kid's watching over their shoulder, or they come over and watch on their phone? So being a good role model in general, putting up your screen, making sure that you're not distracted, setting apart that screen time. It's really hard to correct a kid on limiting their screen time if you're on your screen the entire time. And so we talk about that all the time. Okay, next slide. This is one of my favorite. Each day of our lives, we make a deposit in the memory banks of our children. And so think about what you want to be in those memory banks. And if our children are on screens all day, it's really hard to place those memories in that memory bank. And there's ways you can make it fun. My daughter and I, she's 12, and so she's like prime time wanting screen time. And, you know, we make it a game. A lot of phones, our phone shows us what our screen time was. And from week to week, like if it increased or decreased, we make it a game to decrease both of us, to decrease our screen time. So I know that when that notification pops up, I'm usually at work and she'll call me. She's like, hey, did your screen time reduce? Mine reduced this. So she is like on it. She loves doing it. and it helps with her reducing it. And so it helps with me reducing my screen time. So it definitely has an impact. And there's a lot of research, even if you're, if you're having a problem as a parent reducing your screen time, there's a lot of research that identifies changing different, I think we've talked about it on here before, but changing different things like turning off notifications or changing the color of your notifications, changing your screens to all, black and white, and that reduces that part of the stimulation to the brain that makes you want to go look at it. For adolescents, that's one of the big triggers are the notifications. They want to see how many likes they got, how many notifications there are. And so that when that pops up on their phone, that's that addictive component where they feel like they got to look at it. So just turning that phone, we've talked about like keeping the phone face down. So really sometimes it can be simple solutions over a long period of time to reduce that. And then the last page is just the references. Any questions, anybody?
Thank you so much, Amanda. That was awesome. Donna, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Amanda, that was wonderful. I really could relate to a lot of those things that you're mentioning. And I just, you mentioned before that I'd worked for Head Start, early Head Start, and that was a big thing. And I honestly don't always agree with all that no screen time, because I need to do a lot of educational things. And my husband does early childhood music with children, and he helped children learn to read because it was an interactive. They could go up and learn it doing that. And I will tell you, like the thing you said about the books, I make books with my grandchildren. So I made them a copy, and I had a copy, and I would read them during this COVID because we couldn't see them. So they'd open theirs with their dad, and I would read mine because they wanted to hear us read to them. So that was a great thing to have, just that double copy. And then I did have, when you talked early, I have these parents that start, we don't know why our child, I think the boy was 3 or 4, and he was having nightmares about wolves. And the same thing, they were watching horror movies about werewolves. And they're like, he's not paying any attention, he's way in bed. Well, he was waking up with wolves coming through his windows in the middle of the night. And then when I talked to him, I said, he is hearing that. Yeah. But it was amazing that they didn't even connect that werewolf movie had anything to do with the wolves coming through their child room.
Right, I agree. I think that's great that you're reading to your granddaughters and staying connected that way, and them having the same, I mean, that's an amazing way to stay connected.
They love hearing their names and seeing their pictures. And so that my husband, we have some older grandchildren. We have teenager grandchildren, but we have these new batch of these little ones, and they love the Baby Shark. The parents are almost sick of that, but my husband did the Baby Shark song with their children in it, and their dogs in it, and their cats in it, and they love that. And then when they're here, like we have a pool, and we're doing the Ring Around the Rosie in the pool. And they have, the kids kind of have lost those yard games. Yeah. So that my little 3-year-old's like, again. And my husband popped up like the weasel, So they love doing that interaction. And like you said, they saw that on the video, like they'd see that song, but to do it in person, then they made it 3D, So it is amazing to see those things working. And just one more thing, I remember when my son, he's 30 now, and when Fantasia came out, and he was probably 4 or 5, and he was watching that, and he loved certain parts. And then he'd say, well, that's Tchaikovsky's, da-da-da-da. And I'm like, okay, because he's listening to even who the composer is. So they're like sponges.
They really are like sponges, and they're listening all the time.
I was just going to say, too, I remember when I was like a younger kid, I would always like hear what my parents were watching, and I would be so intrigued, like, oh, they're watching like like R-rated movie, and I'd be interested. I'd like walk around the corner and like try to listen. So I know kids are also super curious and interested in what their parents are doing. So I can definitely relate to that personally. I know you touched upon this, Amanda, with like parents being role models and things like that, and kids sort of being the product of their environment and things around them. But I was going to ask you, do you find yourself, since COVID hit, do you find yourself talking to parents more about working from home? Because I'm sure the kids see their parents working from home on their laptops and taking phone calls and stuff. And that's sort of inevitable with the parents having to continue work and stuff. But do you find yourself having that conversation with parents as well?
Yeah, so I just actually wrote an article about this, so hopefully it gets published. It's under review, but yeah, when this all first started, you know, we talked with parents about, it seemed like they were in crisis mode. Like they were, you know, they were just trying to figure out how to work from home, what they need to do to get the kids in line with school. And so it seemed like that was like the first phase. And then the second phase was, you know, all about the frustrations, like their frustrations with working from home and how it's not working and how kids interfere and how we need to set guidelines with that and how to get their flow going so that they can be stay-at-home parents, they can be school teachers, and they can manage their, you know, their house and work at the same time, right? So they had all these things to do at the same time. And so really just kind of processing through that and kind of structuring that out. That's a lot of what we've been doing. And then parents finally realizing this is not going away and starting to realize their underlying stress and children's underlying stress, and that this is not okay. I'm not okay. Like I'm overwhelmed. And I think especially towards the end of the school year, parents were so relieved when they didn't have to do school anymore. And so they really started to realize the stress that they were under and that they were taking on. So yeah, we've been processing a lot of that, and a lot of screen time is coming from that. So they're wondering if their children being exposed to screen time for school is impacting. And again, we've talked about not it being the time, but being the content and the involvement. And so a lot of the school screen time, teachers are involved, the parents are right there and involved. And so it's a little different. Yeah, you want to take a break from screen time before you can introduce a different screen time. So maybe figuring out something in between. And yeah, we've worked a lot on schedules and how to develop those schedules so that they had a routine that the kids feel safe and secure, because they had the underlying stress as well. Kids were dealing with such extreme stress because there's a huge loss. There's a huge loss of their life as they knew it, and you know, their interactions with their peers, and depending on their age, it had different impacts. So early on children, their peers, they need that physical touch, that physical exploration. They need to relate to one another. And then older kids really were having an impact as well, because you know, from 12 on, that's their lives are their peers. Like that's all they want to be around are their peers. And now you're telling them no, that they can't. And so stress on total, you know, two ends of the spectrum in different levels. And so it had a huge impact on them. Still does, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Well, that was super.
I just wanted to say, Amanda, did you ever watch, I know you guys are a lot younger than me, did you ever watch those after school specials where I love those, and my kids were middle age, and I like demanded they watch those because they would show you this scenario, and then they would do 3 different endings to, like somebody took, you know, was mad at their girlfriend, they took a gun to school, you know, and then they and shot each other. Then they pulled that back, and now there's no gun. So then they had to do conflict resolution. And I felt like they kind of gave them some tools. And I would love to see that come back.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I remember it all through my childhood, and I wasn't allowed to watch anything after school except the after school special. And so once I was done with that, I had to do my homework. So I wanted to watch the after school special. But yeah, absolutely. It provided you with conflict resolution, decision making. I mean, it really hit a lot of those social behaviors that were happening and allowed kids to kind of think about it and talk about it. And I think that could be very beneficial if it came back, because a lot of parents don't feel comfortable talking about those things, and it gives them a tool to start having that conversation. Again, staying involved and having that conversation with them. What do you think you would do? What would you do in that situation? What did you think about what so-and-so did, right? And so it really allows and opens up for that conversation.
Well, even you had said about Mr. Rogers, we have, Aubrey, my 3-year-old, we have a DVD with Benjamin, the tiger from Mr. Rogers, his name's Daniel the tiger. And,
Yeah.
and, you know, the teacher says it's okay to be angry. You can be angry, you know. So I think the validating that those feelings are real and it's okay, but helping the child to know how to cope with those feelings. And that's what I was actually, as a therapist with my husband today, he has lymphedema, and we were talking about the kids don't seem to have those coping mechanisms now. There's nobody teaching. And I think that is a big issue, because we just, and I think you're right, a lot of the young parents I worked with in Head Start, I don't think they knew how to do it, so they didn't know how to teach their children to do it. Right.
I use a lot of, you know, when we talk about screen time, I use a lot of different social stories. So I will, and especially during COVID, right? That's what I pull up on my computer, you know, and so I had a kid who has intellectual disability, and I was like dreading his telehealth session, because I was like, I can't even get this kid to engage in session. Like, there's no way I'm getting him to engage. But he pulled right into the telehealth, and he loved the screen. So we did social stories. There's a social story called Buddy Knows, and there's all kind of different social stories with that, how to manage anger, how to manage public situations. Okay. And so I do a lot of social stories with kids who pull into the screen time.
We had something like that. I'll find that and send it to you. We had something like that in Head Start that was free from the government. So, but it helped. It asked open-ended questions, and there would be children talk about, well, my daddy hits me, and they, you know, that came out because they were teaching the kids, how do you handle your anger? And then the other kids are like, you mean your daddy doesn't hit you? So, I mean, it was very well done, from anything from brushing your teeth to abuse. So those were great, and a lot of the teachers didn't know how to do those open-ended questions either. So these were cartoon character cards, and then there was music to go with them. And I was a nurse, so I found this program and downloaded, and it was wonderful. I'll have to send it to you so you can look at it if I can remember. It's been a while, but those are great tools.
There is it's called In the Incredible Years. So The Incredible Years is a parenting program, and it's evidence-based. And that's one of the parenting programs I teach that I talk about my Fred Rogers shows in there. But in The Incredible Years, there's teacher versions too. And there's a detective kit, and it's called Wally's Detective Kit. And it's fabulous. It has like 4 books to it. And then it has a social story book. And it talks about different social interactions that Wally comes across and how to process it with kids. But it gives teachers exact questions they can ask kids to help them process their emotions and how they would resolve the conflict.
Yeah, it was great, because this could be, it was all free, the downloads of all the things. So you could also give it to the parents to use at home. So it was really a good tool. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. I've been very excited. This was very great to hear.
You were my solo attendant. I mean, besides you guys.
That was really excellent. I personally learned so much too. And I always say, I feel like I learned so much about how to be a parent too from these sessions, when I have a child, of course. But so I really appreciate it, Amanda. That was excellent. Before we part ways, any questions, last comments? Jay, I saw that little, what was that little figurine?
Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Rogers.
Big,
oh, wow.
All right.
Mr. Rogers guy. Grew up in Pittsburgh. Got to meet Mr. McFeely many times. This was my guy.
Me too.
So, yeah.
You know, that's the thing. And Mr. Rogers has been my, you know, when we've had these horrible things happen, I have posted many times, because it gives me comfort. You look for the helpers, you look for the good. Yeah. And I mean, even as an adult, I find comfort in what he did, you know. So I definitely share that with the children.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, this was an awesome session. We had a really great discussion. Thank you, Amanda, so much.
You're welcome. It's nice to see so many smiles.
I know, it's really is the new form of interaction.
Yeah.
Speaking of screen time, so so just two brief quick announcements. Our next session will be on August 5th, and Lauren Swagger will be providing the didactic on motivational interviewing. And the other quick announcement is just that most likely Zoom is going to require us to have a password implemented for our session. So when we have more information about that, I'll be sure to send you guys all that info. So just keep an eye out for that. But all right, guys. Well, thanks so much, Amanda, again.
Virtual hugs, virtual hugs.
Virtual hugs, yes.
That's right.
There you go. All right, we'll see you guys next time.
Bye.
Bye.